Hello, and welcome to our webinar covering the Claritas 2023 Demographic and Cartographic Updates, which feature 2020 census data and more. My name is Eliza Albert, and I'm one of our product strategy managers here at Claritas. So I'll be taking you through these important updates today. So we'll start out with an overview of what we're going to cover. So we have some changes to the 2023 vintage, and a lot of them are related to the impact of the 2020 census because we have new 2020 census based boundaries and rosters, as well as more 2020 census data being incorporated. So we'll talk about the impact this has to the Claritas data, how we're responding to undercounts and overcounts, other adjustments that we're making, and how we're estimating for items not available from the 2020 census, whether it's data that should be available in the future or data that won't be available in the census. We'll also talk about the benefits of the new census data, as well as other changes coming to the Culture Code Supplement and AMDS products. So we'll start with the 2020 census impact. So even in an ordinary update cycle, trending should be done with caution. This is because to take full advantage of methodological refinements and new data sources, each of our updates begins with data from the most recent decennial census or the American Community Survey, also abbreviated as the ACS, rather than the previous year's estimates. So the difference between estimates for consecutive years is not an estimate of change from one year to the next. Instead, change is estimated with reference to previous census numbers or the ACS. So changes in data values could be caused by a combination of many things, including differing methodologies, revisions to data sources. For example, the Census Bureau may revise their own estimates based on things like natural disasters, business openings and closings, etc. Also new data sources, such as a new census, or a true change in data values. But the bottom line is when something as big as new census data and geographic rosters are incorporated, it has a major impact on our data. So we'll start by looking at the census geography changes, as well as the definitions of these geographic levels for those of you who may not be as familiar with the census geographies. So the 2023 Claritas vintage is the first to switch to 2020 census geographic rosters and definitions. So the following geographies have updated boundaries and rosters as a result. First is blocks. These are the smallest geography the census reports data for. They're bounded by city streets in many areas, but they can be larger in more rural areas and follow different types of features. And these are represented by centroids in our Claritas PotFax block product. We do not have boundaries for blocks. Our boundaries start with block groups, which are a group of blocks and a subdivision of census tracts. These are based on a consistent range of population counts, so spatial size can vary greatly. Then census tracts are small statistical subdivisions of counties. These are defined by a local committee of census data users for presenting decennial census data. Then, of course, counties are the primary political and administrative subdivisions of a state. They're known as boroughs or parishes in some states, and we also have census areas up in Alaska, which are county equivalents. Then we have places, which are concentration of population, such as cities and incorporated towns that have legally prescribed boundaries, powers, and functions. And then finally, we have minor civil divisions, or MCDs. These are government and or administrative subdivisions of a county, so things like townships, precincts, or magisterial districts. This level also includes census civil divisions, or CCDs. These are like MCDs, but they're created by the Census Bureau with input from state and local officials for presenting census data. So if a state has MCDs, those are what those are. And then if it does not have MCDs, it will have CCDs instead. Now I wanted to show you a roster count comparison between the 2020 census, which is being used for our 2023 vintage, and the 2010 census, which was last used for the 2022 vintage. So starting with block, we actually do have a reduction there. We're now over 7 million as opposed to over 10 million before, and that might be some cleanup on the Census Bureau's end. But with Black groups, because again, those are based on a consistent range of population counts, as population has increased, the number of Black groups has also gone up. So we're now over 239,000 as opposed to around the 217,000 from before. Tracts have also increased to over 84,000 from over 72,000. We also have one additional county this year because there was actually a split up in Alaska. The Valdez-Cordova census area has now been split into the Chugach census area and the Copper River census area. Place has also increased to over 31,000 from over 29,000. And MCD is still around 35,000, but we have 74 fewer with this update. Now let's take a look at how we're using available census files. So state resident population data were used in our 2022 update. These were released in April 2021. And they're also called apportionment counts because they're used to apportion or divide the 435 seats in the House of Representatives among the 50 states. We also now have redistricting summary data being used in the 2023 update. These were released in August of 2021, and they're also called PL, which stands for Public Law 94-171, and they're used by states to inform their legislative redistricting, which is important ahead of the November 22 midterm elections. But it's also important for Claritas because it's the first release of data for small geographies such as Blacks and Black groups. It includes population, household, and housing unit-based counts, so this is much more granular than the data we had before. And it's being used for Claritas-based counts, which impact all of our other data categories. It also includes population by race and ethnicity and population in group quarters by type of facility, so related estimates were also influenced by this data. So let's talk about the impact this has on the 2023 data. Users will see greater differences in our estimates due to the use of the 2020 census data in geographies. Now, the national and state population totals are not dramatically different because of the use of the 2020 census apportionment data in the 2022 vintage. However, there will be more variation in categories involving race and ethnicity, and we'll talk about that momentarily. However, counties are seeing some significant changes. And this is because when we built the 2022 estimates, we relied on 2020 Census Bureau county population estimates because county level data was not yet available from the 2020 census itself. But both Claritas and the Census Bureau's estimates now have the benefit of using 2020 census data for counties. And then small geographies will have the most change. Again, Black groups have significant roster changes in addition to new data. And zip codes are also impacted by a combination of their own annual boundary changes, plus changes to blocks and block groups, since block centroids are used to assign block group data to these areas in our process. So now let's talk about the race and ethnicity changes that the census implemented this year. So they actually changed their coding method for race and ethnicity in 2020. Respondents were allowed to enter as many groups as they wanted into these categories, but in the past, only the first 30 characters were coded. But this time they expanded to 200 characters. So by doing this, it contributed to an overall increase in the 2 or more races category because they were coding more data. Hispanic related responses to the race category were also coded as some other race for the first time. So that contributed to an overall increase in that category. So for example, if somebody responded to the race question that they were Mexican or Cuban, they would have automatically been coded as some other race instead of being assigned to a different category. So you see at the bottom, we've got some comparisons between the 2010 and 2020 census. So the 2 or more races category, a very significant increase here. It was under 3% of the population in 2010. It's now over 10% of the population in 2020. And then for some other race, also a modest increase. It was a little over 6% of the population in 2010 and is now well over 8% in 2020. Next, I'd like to talk about how Claritas is addressing the undercounts and overcounts reported by the census. So the Census Bureau estimates these based on something called the post-enumeration survey, which is a sample survey that they conduct after every decennial census is taken. So at the national level, they estimated statistically significant undercounts of the Hispanic and Black populations. So Claritas took the following actions to improve our 2023 estimates for these categories based on this information. First, we established a national Hispanic target based on the 2020 census results and the estimated undercount. However, total population only had a small undercount, so this required reduction of counts in other groups. So that reduction was most significant for the white non-Hispanic group, which had a statistically significant overcount. Extra caution was also taken not to reduce the Black or African American non-Hispanic group due to the significant undercount of the Black population. So combined with the increase to the Hispanic population, this resulted in an increase to the overall Black or African American population compared to the 2020 census. Then at the state level, the Census Bureau estimated undercounts and overcounts for total population. Claritas is confident that the use of the Census Bureau's July 2021 estimates in the 2023 vintage has mitigated any issues posed by these results. Because in states with statistically significant overcounts or undercounts, the Census Bureau's estimates reflect directional differences that align with those overcounts and undercounts. So when we reviewed these, we felt like our 2023 estimates were in a good place and we didn't need to make additional adjustments. So now let's talk about the Claritas 2020 adjusted base counts. So these were done in response to the new differential privacy method that's being used on the published 2020 census numbers. Because with advances in technology, the Census Bureau wanted better privacy protections for their data. So differential privacy was applied to everything except housing unit totals. However, this introduced what we would consider logical inconsistencies and improbable values in some areas. So a logical inconsistency would be something like households with no population. By census definition, a household is an occupied housing unit. So in order to have a household, you have to have population there to occupy that household. Then an improbable value would be something like an extremely large average household size. So if we looked at an area and we took the population minus anyone in group quarters, and then divided that by the number of households and got an average household size of something very large like 50, we would want to make adjustments to get that back to a more reasonable number. So to resolve these issues for use in our own estimates, Claritas made small adjustments to 2020 population, households, vacant housing units, and group quarters population in about 600 block groups. So a very small percentage of block groups where these adjustments were made. But the method was based on research done to compare the original 2010 census data, which did not use differential privacy, to a set of demonstration data, which applied that new method to the 2010 census data, allowing for a direct comparison. These adjustments are published in their own PopFacts category, and they have been rolled up from block group to our other geographies as well. And no other data in the 2020 category was adjusted. Everything else is as published in the census itself. All right, now let's talk about census data that's still coming. So Claritas is waiting for something called the Demographic and Housing Characteristics File, or the DHC. This will contain additional 2020 census data similar to the categories that were in the 2010 SF1 or Summary File 1 release. So this should include things like population by sex and age, households by age of householder, household size and composition, tenure, whether someone's an owner or renter, as well as households by race and ethnicity. Now, a quick note on this, the Claritas method for 2023 used the Census 2010 ratio of householders by race and ethnicity to population by race and ethnicity, and then applied that ratio to the current year estimates of population by race and ethnicity, which are, of course, based on the new 2020 census numbers. So there's a little bit of a 2020 element there, even though this data hasn't been directly released yet. But we are going to be evaluating our schedule because the Census Bureau is planning to release the DHC at the end of May 2023. So we're hoping with that timeline, we can still incorporate it into our 2024 vintage, but we will announce as plans are solidified and communicate if anything changes, either on our side or the Census Bureau's. All right, next, let's talk about what we're doing while we're waiting for the DHC. So Claritas continued using our current methodology and sources, including the 2010 census for most items. However, we switched to the American Community Survey, or ACS, for the following: tenure, specifically the percentage of owners versus renter-occupied housing units, and also households by number of people. Now, this is currently expected to be available in the DHC, but it may not include the family versus non-family distinctions currently found in our PopFacts products. However, there may be an option to report by tenure instead, so we will keep an eye on that. Now let's talk about data that's not coming to the DHC. So the DHC will not include detailed ancestry or origin information. This might be available in another 2020 census product called the Detailed DHC, but that would not be available for detailed geographic areas due to privacy concerns. So Claritas has decided to use the ACS as the primary source for Hispanic origins in all of our products. We previously used 2010 census data as the primary source for PopFacts and a combination of sources for AMDS. So we have some 2023 to 2022 vintage comparisons for the different products available on the following slides that we'll go through. Claritas will also use the ACS as the primary source for Asian origins in all products going forward. Now, the ACS has been used as the primary source for this data in PopFacts products for several years, so PopFacts users will not see significant change in the distribution between groups. However, this will represent a change for AMDS users, so we again have a 2023 to 2022 vintage comparison available for AMDS that we'll go over. So if we look at the Hispanic origin national comparison here for PopFacts Premier, you can see there's very little difference in the percent distribution at the national level because these are very summarized categories. Now, if we look at PopFacts Advanced and the Culture Code supplement to PopFacts, we have some more detailed breakouts here. But the main thing to note is that the all other category has decreased while some of the other categories have increased. But for AMDS, the biggest changes here are a decrease in the Mexican distribution, an increase in the Cuban distribution, and an increase in the other distribution. So I wanted to talk a bit about what the ACS includes in the other category. So in addition to the Spaniard, Spanish, and Spanish American items that you see listed there, it also includes several identities that are not elsewhere classified. So it's very possible that some of these people have Mexican heritage, but in some cases they may prefer using general terms such as Latin American, Latino, or a similar variation. While this can be strictly a matter of preference, it may also be because they have origins with multiple groups. Additionally, this category also includes people who self-report other less common origins, such as California, Tejano, or Mesoamerican Indian, when given the opportunity. Now, let's take a look at the Asian origin national comparison for AMDS. So what I want to point out here is you'll see the other Asian category says that it now is including 2+ categories in 2023. And this is because unlike other ACS ancestry and origin tables that only report the first origin the respondent listed, this table includes a specific grouping for people who report belonging to 2 or more Asian origins. So this contributes to the increase in this category's distribution for 2023. So, for example, if someone responded to the ACS saying that they were both Filipino and Japanese, they would not be tabulated in either the Filipino or Japanese category. Instead, they would be included in the two or more Asian categories group that's now rolled in with other Asian. And finally, I want to talk about data that's not available for census years. So, as you may have seen, 2000 census data is being removed from our products with this update. And after the 2000 census, the long form questionnaire was discontinued. This questionnaire asked about things like household income, home value, education, and employment. So these types of questions are now asked by the American Community Survey, or ACS, but ACS data for small areas is summarized over 5 years of survey collection, so there's no true census year equivalents to publish. The ACS also has less detail for some categories, like income, than what we publish in our products. So in these cases, Claritas combines ACS data with other sources to estimate for the current year and project that forward. But it's difficult to accurately estimate back to a specific point in time. So we wanted to provide our users with some recommendations in this case now that the census data is not available. So you want to trend with caution, whether you're comparing to something like ACS data or to past Claritas updates. A good tip is to always look at percent distributions instead of the estimates themselves, because there are many reasons totals from other sources or past updates differ. It's also good to be mindful of potential differences in geographic areas, such as a change to the census geographies or changes to things like zip codes. You also want to be mindful of any methodology changes that are documented in our annual demographic update methodology document. It's also a good idea to review our annual largest differences document. This document examines the greatest differences in county population and median household income between our last two updates, so it can be a valuable resource in this case. Okay, next let's talk about the benefits of the 2020 census. So the 2020 census is the most recent and complete count of the US population. No other survey or data source really comes close to this because the federal government is the only entity that has both the necessary resources and the authority to conduct a survey of this scale, and they still only attempt it once a decade. But also, being able to compare the available 2020 data to our 2023 estimates will give users an opportunity to see how areas have changed in recent years. Now, our data sources don't explicitly publish migration from point A to point B on a small, detailed scale, but we do use sources that reflect the impact of migration. So, for example, the Census Bureau's population estimates for states and counties include migration data from IRS tax return data that was matched for 2 points in time. Also, trends in USPS active residential address counts and household totals from the internal Claritas master address file reflect the outcome of migration on population growth and decline. So, if an area's population grew or declined significantly, especially due to the COVID-19 pandemic, these sources would reflect those changes. So it's a great opportunity to start to look at that. And finally, I want to talk about some other changes to our Culture Code Supplement and AMDS products that will happen with the 2023 releases. So, unfortunately, population by ethnicity, race, and tenure has to be discontinued due to a lack of source data. We found out that the Census Bureau will not be publishing this as part of the 2020 census, and it also does not publish this data in any of its other products. So, households by tenure, ethnicity, and race from PopFax Advanced will be added to the Culture Code Supplement. That way, anyone who's using the supplement in combination with PopFax Premier will get this data since it's somewhat similar. However, AMDS already has this data available, so nothing new to add there. On a related note, average household size by ethnicity and race will also be removed. This is because population by ethnicity, race, and tenure was the only source that told us approximately how many people of each ethnicity or race were living in households as opposed to group quarters facilities. However, even with this data, it was still difficult to reliably calculate average household size for each group because people of different ethnicities or races often reside in the same household, but available data is not that detailed. So, for example, even in areas without group quarters facilities, simply dividing the Hispanic population by households with a Hispanic householder could still result in an unrealistic Hispanic average household size for some areas. Total average household size will remain in both products for reference. In better news, we are going to update our generations categories. So we're taking this opportunity to align our definitions with the latest from Pew Research. First, the greatest generation category will be removed because the youngest members will turn 99 in 2023. So it's getting difficult to break this out because we don't have a lot of data for older ages. So the silent generation category will now be anyone born 1945 or earlier. So anyone who's technically part of the greatest generation will be summarized with that category in our products. The baby boomer generation is also being updated to 1946 to 1964. This previously ended at 1965. So, on a related note, Generation X will now be 1965 to 1980. That previously began at 1966. The millennial generation will also be updated to be 1981 to 1996. That previously ended at 1997. So Generation Z will be 1997 through 2012. That previously began at 1998. And we'll be adding Generation Alpha as 2013 or later. Now, please note that the ending for Generation Z has not been officially established by Pew Research at this time, but 2012 is what they used in a recent chart comparing all generations. But Claritas will keep an eye on these definitions for future updates and will adjust Generation Z and Generation Alpha as appropriate. So that's all the content we have for today. If you have any questions, please reach out to us and we'll be happy to provide more information. And thank you again for listening in.